A 41-year-old Texas woman is trapped in a violent marriage. After barely surviving a previous attack, she gains distance and the hope of a fresh start. But slowly, he lures her back into his web, and then one day, she vanishes. Her family receives a letter from her stating that she's leaving her husband, but they grow suspicious when they don't hear from her. Her husband was uncooperative and maintained that she just up and left their family. It would take nearly 2 decades and the abduction of another woman for the world to see just how evil he really was. And while his wife's case remains unsolved, one question lingers. How many more are still out there? I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the disappearance and suspected homicide of Martha Martinez Maxwell. Just as a content warning up front, this case discusses intimate partner violence and some graphic content around sexual assault. As usual, I won't include any more than is necessary, but it does end up being a bit more than usual because of how some of the specific details tie the cases together, so please take care when listening. It was April 19th, 1987, and Martha Martinez Maxwell woke up in a daze. That feeling when you've fallen asleep on the couch instead of your bed and you wake up trying to orient yourself to the world around you. But once she got her bearings, this was something much more. The night before, Martha and her husband of 6 years, Jeffrey Allen Maxwell, had argued, and like other times in their tumultuous relationship, Jeffrey had physically abused her, striking her repeatedly. This time as she woke up, she realized she couldn't move her hands and that they were bound behind her back with duct tape. According to statements she later made to police, Martha said that as she woke up, her husband Jeffrey attached a device to her breasts that he used to then shock her. He then forced her to drink a beverage that consisted of brandy and vodka and used it to wash down 2 sleeping pills and 4 Anacin tablets. After that, everything went black. At the time, Martha and Jeffrey were living with their young son in the city of Watauga in Tarrant County, Texas, just outside of Fort Worth. When Martha was found, she was barely clinging to life. She was found still bound on the side of Interstate 35, about 10 miles north of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and over 100 miles from home. She had severe injuries all over, including her neck being cut all the way across. Martha was rushed to the hospital, and police were working to figure out how to notify those closest to her that she had been found and was being treated at the hospital for life-threatening injuries. None of the source material explicitly states this, but I assume that she had some form of identification on her because police in Oklahoma knew to contact Watauga police and knew that her name was Martha Martinez Maxwell. When authorities out of Texas found that her emergency contact was her husband Jeffrey, they went to him and let him know that they had found his wife, she had been attacked, and they said, boy, did he look surprised. Martha amazingly survived this ordeal, and when she was able to speak to police, she told them that it had been her husband who had attacked her, and she shared every detail. Investigators in Watauga sprung into action and initiated a search of the home, a modest house in the 6,000 block of, believe it or not, Martha Drive. They also obtained a search warrant of Jeffrey's vehicle. Based on the information that Martha provided them about the attack that night and the ongoing sexual torture and abuse, they expected to find devices and weapons. Also, given the brutality of Martha's attack, they expected to find signs of a struggle and blood. But they didn't. There was no evidence in the home besides handcuffs, photos of sexually explicit reading material, and a few other uncited items that they collected for evidence. Some of the books that were found were titled Bound, Whipped, and Caged Schoolgirls, and another was called Bondage for 3 Wives. If I had to guess, the police calling him as next of kin to let him know of Martha's attack and survival probably motivated him to do a cleanup and disposal job, destroying evidence before police got to it. Nevertheless, Jeffrey Maxwell was arrested and charged with aggravated assault. When Martha was well enough to be discharged from the hospital, she took their young son and fled to Mexico to be with her family. Martha grew up in Mexico and met Jeffrey Maxwell in 1981 through a mail matchmaking service. They exchanged letters back and forth, and the romance blossomed. Jeffrey had been previously married very young, when he was just 18 years old, after he got his girlfriend Rita pregnant. But that relationship didn't work out. The family that most often is interviewed about Martha is her brother Javier, who lived in Denver with his wife Carol. According to reporting in D Magazine, when Jeffrey came to propose to Martha, they did not approve. Martha's sister-in-law Carol said, quote, "We just didn't like him. Everyone tried to be nice to him, but he gave people such a creepy feeling." Despite her family's feelings about Jeffrey, Martha felt like she was getting older, and at 29, she wanted to settle down and start a family. Carol said, quote, "She was insecure, and he preyed upon that." Carol and Javier had just been dating at that time, and when they got married, Martha brought Jeffrey as her +1 to their wedding. Carol told D Magazine that at the reception, Jeffrey approached her and said, "Now that we're family, I guess that means I get to kiss you," and forcefully kissed her, shoving his tongue in her mouth. She said a few months later, he did this with another bride at a family wedding. According to an interview with Martha's brother Javier in the newspaper The Bryan College Station Eagle, Martha had talked with her family about leaving Jeffrey before and how he was abusive to her, but said she was fearful that she would lose her young son in the process. One thing I couldn't find for certain was the citizenship status of Martha. That is certainly something that can create a power dynamic, as Jeffrey Maxwell was an American citizen born and raised here, and custody disputes can get complicated in the midst of things like parents from 2 different countries and immigration issues. While in Mexico recuperating, Martha began to open up to her family about just how terribly Jeffrey was to her. Previously, she had confided in a few friends about some aspects of her abuse, sharing bruises on her wrists and legs, but she had otherwise kept this from her family. She now told them how Jeffrey would tie her up and leave her in a tiny room by herself for days. And despite coming forward with all of this, she said she felt like police and the judges just didn't believe her, which I think is so important to highlight that. How many stories have you heard from survivors of intimate partner violence where repeatedly they are not believed by people in charge of protecting them? It's a huge systemic issue. And honestly, I don't feel it's much better in 2025. We still have a long way to go. So that's not a simpler time thing. It was like that back then, and it still is. While all this was going on, Jeffrey also began mailing Martha letters. In them, he was incredibly apologetic. He talked about how much he missed her, how much he missed their son, and he begged her to come back and be with him. Martha's sister-in-law, Carol, told D Magazine that the letters were manipulative in nature and appealed to Martha's Catholic religious beliefs. Jeffrey repeatedly cited that God would want them to be together, and he made veiled statements that blamed her for what had happened. Martha stayed in Mexico for a few months, but ultimately returned back to the United States and moved back in with Jeffrey, despite her parents and family pleading with her not to. When she returned, they left their home and moved to Fort Worth. Upon doing that, she stopped cooperating with law enforcement and the district attorney in the case against Jeffrey Maxwell. Without Martha as a witness and with the lack of physical evidence to have a standalone case, a grand jury failed to indict him and the case was dismissed. When I say stopped cooperating, I phrase it like that because it's objectively and factually what happened. But it's important to remember that she felt like they didn't believe her anyways, and she was stuck in a cycle of abuse and manipulation at the hands of Jeffrey. One other thing I hadn't mentioned is that Martha felt really close to the son Jeffrey had from his first marriage. At this point, of course, they had another son together themselves, but she was drawn back in because she also loved her stepson as one of her own, and she couldn't bear to leave him. As so often occurs, after she returned, there was a bit of a honeymoon period. Martha actually went and got her associate's degree. She brought Jeffrey Maxwell to her family reunion, and her relatives who loathed him managed to try to make some small talk, hoping that he genuinely had turned it around. But the violence picked back up again. Martha did her best to navigate everything she was experiencing and was very private about it, protecting her son in the process. She still kept in regular contact with her family, having phone calls with them, and they had one such phone call on Mother's Day, May 10th, 1992. Later in that month, her family hadn't heard from her and they began to worry. And that worry only grew when they went to their mailbox one day and found a letter from her. One afternoon, Martha's parents opened their mailbox to find something peculiar. A letter from Martha. Word in the family spread quickly because this just wasn't like Martha. Another family member received the same letter, presumably Javier and Carol. But Martha didn't mail letters. She always just talked to them by phone, and the contents of the letter were even more puzzling. The letter was telling them that she planned to leave Jeffrey and her son, and that she would be out of touch for a while. This didn't sit right with them. They felt that either someone else had written this letter or that Martha had been forced to write it. Adding to that was the fact that it looked like more than one type of handwriting had been used between the two letters. In the rare occasion that Martha did write something to her family, it was always in Spanish, but these letters were in English. So Martha's brother Javier called the Maxwell residence to speak to his sister and figure out what was going on. When he did, Jeffrey answered. He abruptly stated that Martha had left and ended that call. Javier told the paper, quote, "It was odd because she would have just called us, and where would she go? We got worried, and I talked to Jeff. He said she left, and he hung up on me. I knew then that he did something to her." End quote. Javier Martinez and Martha's parents phoned the Fort Worth police for assistance, but they didn't exactly do anything to start. So Javier caught the next flight out of Denver down to Texas and filed a missing persons report. And only after he came in person would they accept one. According to Javier, he did feel that the detective assigned worked hard on her case. But there was no sign of Martha and Jeffrey was not cooperating. At the Maxwell residence, Martha had left behind everything she would need to start over. Her social security card was there, her credit cards, and her car. It just didn't make any sense. Still, there was no physical evidence, and Jeffrey stuck with his story. Martha's family felt hopeless. They knew Jeffrey had done something to her, and he was able to just go on living his life without facing any consequences and without giving them answers of their own. And that he did. Now, shortly after Martha's disappearance, Jeffrey was in a significant motorcycle accident that injured his leg permanently. He then walked with a limp and sometimes had to use a cane. In 1995, he filed for divorce from Martha, stating that she was missing and had abandoned him, and also cited things that would fall under the irreconcilable differences category. The divorce was granted, and he remarried his first wife, Rita. At this point, Rita had 3 girls of her own from another relationship. Police records would later show that 2 nights before their wedding, Jeffrey allegedly raped Rita's best friend. Her friend rented a duplex from Jeffrey, and she had a maintenance concern. When he came over to fix it, she says that he forced himself on her and then threatened her if she ever told anybody. Some publications share more details than I'm choosing not to on this podcast, but not long after moving in together, Jeffrey's stepdaughters accused him of sexual abuse. First, the middle daughter told school officials, but it doesn't sound like much happened when she reported other than documentation. CPS may have been called, but really there was nothing further done. But then the younger daughter detailed an instance of something that happened to her school, and this time CPS for sure was called, and CPS ordered Rita away from Jeffrey or threatened to take the children altogether. And so Rita did leave and they split, but Jeffrey still faced no criminal consequences for his behavior. Jeffrey went on to move around a bit, and wherever he went, people seemed to find him creepy, and he'd occasionally get a slap on the wrist for said creepy behavior. But he also was known in the community for good things, and he held high up positions. For instance, he was the VP of the Kiwanis Club in town. Martha's family watched as year after year passed, and they wondered, would anybody besides them see the true colors and true evil of Jeffrey Maxwell? And it would take until 2011, but after that, the whole world would know. The next part of this episode discusses the survivor's story of Lois Pearson. Because this story is her own to tell, I'm going to share enough to tie together the episode, but allow you to read her own words as documented in D Magazine and a couple of other sources which I've linked in the show notes. Huge appreciation to D Magazine reporting by Michael J. Mooney, which I relied on heavily for this part. I also want to mention that it's not typical to share the name of survivors of sexual assault. I am doing so because after the trial, Lois wanted her name shared openly in the media as a way of sharing her courageous story. And so let's get into it. Lois Pearson was born in 1949, and at 62 years old in 2011, she was still living in her family's childhood home. Lois was deeply religious and lived a simple life. She cared for her property, lived off her modest income of leasing out some of her land, and leaned into caring for her house and devoting herself to God. She never dated, never had any kids, and she preferred to live a life of some seclusion. The house Lois lived in was in Witt, Texas, in rural northwest Parker County on 60 acres. Every Sunday, she attended church. She drove a 40-year-old vehicle, and when she experienced car trouble, she'd walk to church, a 20-mile round trip. Once a month, she'd go into the town of Mineral Wells to pick up groceries and do her laundry. She was fiercely independent and self-reliant. She had previously lived in the house with her parents, and when they died, she just took it over and kept a life of solitude. In 2001, Jeffrey Maxwell purchased the property to the west of her, and he introduced himself. She said he was friendly, albeit a bit intimidating at 6'5" and nearly 300 pounds. She was a few years older than Maxwell. She said they exchanged pleasantries and waves as they passed each other on the country roads. Once he helped her secure a tractor to mow some of her land, and she repaid him with produce that she had grown. And then one day out of nowhere, he asked her out for a dinner date. Lois was very modest in her approach to dating. She just didn't do it and wasn't planning on starting at this point in her life. She told Jeffrey that his ask made her uncomfortable, and she declined. Then, one day, Jeffrey showed up to her house out of the blue. He jumped out of his car and told her that he wanted a kiss. She was at this point very uncomfortable. She told him this wasn't appropriate. She asked him to leave and never come back, and she said he wasn't welcome to her house ever again. Never one to respect boundaries, Jeffrey returned once more, or so she thought. He stopped by to show her pictures of a house he was building several towns over. The conversation was cordial, and Maxwell did indeed move in 2005. On March 1st, 2011, Lois Pearson was getting ready to go out and do her monthly errands in town. She was actually standing beside her car when, to her surprise, Jeffrey Maxwell pulled into her driveway in a Trailblazer. She was very surprised to see him. They made small talk, and he asked her about her church, something that lowered her guard down for a moment. Then, out of nowhere, she described how the mood just shifted, and they stopped talking to one another. She had this sense come over her that something was very wrong, and his face just changed. He pulled out a can of mace and sprayed her in the eyes. She tried to run, but he caught up to her. He dragged her into the house and beat her over the head with a rolling pin and bound her. At one point, he walked out to the car, and Lois was able to quickly free herself of the bindings and took off running out of the back door. When he came back inside and noticed that Lois was gone, he drove his vehicle and caught up to her, this time pointing a pistol at her. He forced her into his vehicle. He asked if she was a virgin, and when she began to cry, he mimicked her cries, mocking her. He told her he was going to bring her to his house and lock her up, and then he was going to come back and burn her house down. She pleaded with him not to burn her house down. It was the only place she'd ever lived and had been in her family for decades. Lois told D Magazine that she thought of so many different ways to try to escape the car, but couldn't pull any of them off, or she just knew they wouldn't work out, like her first escape attempt. So she turned to prayer, and as she was praying, he said, "When I'm through with you, you won't believe in God." In the days that followed, Jeffrey Maxwell tortured Lois. He would handcuff her to a device he made. According to this excerpt from D Magazine, he cuffed each of her hands to the ends of a thick steel bar attached to the ceiling with chains. Confused, she watched him flip a switch on a yellow control box attached by a cable to the same spot in the ceiling as the chains. She felt her arms lifted first, then she felt her shoulders pulled forcefully upward. The motor in the ceiling hummed as she moved higher and higher. When he flipped the switch again, it stopped and she could feel her naked legs dangling in the air. And that's the end of the direct excerpt right there. Essentially, he had created the same type of device you might use to put a deer on after you went hunting. It's just horrible. And again, she details a lot more of the trauma she experienced in this article and in interviews she's done, and I'd prefer you hear her words and let her tell her story, but it should be of note that she continued to turn to prayer throughout her ordeal, and he just would continue to mock her for it each time. He'd even say things like, "Yeah, you better pray." And I highlight this just because it comes up again later. But just know it's way worse and just pure sexual torture for days. At night, when he wasn't abusing her, he kept her chained to a bed, and he even once put her in a coffin-like wooden box. On March 3rd, he had returned to her home and done what he had promised. He had set it on fire. When firefighters put out the blaze, they realized that the only bones were that of a cat. With Lois missing and arson being determined in the fire, police went on an all-out search for her. They drained a nearby pond, they interviewed neighbors, they looked for financial transactions, they took search dogs all over sniffing for any scent trail, searched by helicopter and four-wheelers. I mean, this is a huge rural area. It's a tough task. But they began to have some success when days after Lois went missing, a check from her bank account was cashed and it was made out to none other than Jeffrey Maxwell. Jeffrey's name had also come up with neighbors as someone that Lois had a disagreement with years earlier, and who Lois had been, frankly, creeped out by. One neighbor also remembered seeing a vehicle in the driveway for 10 minutes on March 3rd. They remembered it being there and then it was gone, and then the blaze started. They remembered it had a handicap tag on the rearview mirror. And guess whose vehicle matched that? Jeffrey Maxwell. And remember that motorcycle accident where he hurt his leg? Yeah, that's where the handicap tag came from. So just before 6 p.m. on March 12, 2011, 12 days after Lois was first abducted, Sergeant Rick Montgomery and 4 other investigators paid Jeffrey Maxwell a visit to his home. He smiled as he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch to talk to them, letting them know that his house was such a mess so they could just talk out there. They started out casually, saying that they were just talking to anybody who knew Lois Pearson. And they asked if he had, to which he said, "Well, yeah, she's my old neighbor." Maxwell went on to say that he hadn't been out to that area in a while, which they said, "Oh, really? When was the last time you had contact with her? And he said, well, she did just send me this check because she owed me some money. And for what, they wondered. And he sort of skirted around it, saying he couldn't remember the exact amount, but he had loaned her some money a couple years back because he felt sorry for her. And just then, in the middle of the conversation, the front door swung open and a woman came out screaming, saying, "I'm here, it's me." She was so badly beaten that they didn't even recognize her until one detective said, "Oh my God, that's her." And she said, "I'm Lois Pearson." Texas Ranger Anthony Bradford would go on to tell D Magazine that they all had to pick their jaws off the ground and that none of them had ever experienced anything like that in their careers. Before long, Jeffrey Maxwell was charged with kidnapping and assault. Investigators were shocked when they walked through the home and saw the depravity of the setup. The blood, the torture devices, the chains, everything. It was dubbed a house of horrors, and in some news outlets they compared it to the movie The Silence of the Lambs. Despite pleading not guilty, Jeffrey Maxwell fessed up to most of what he had done and more. He said he had gotten himself into a situation he didn't know how to get out of. He talked about how he had tried bondage with his wife, Martha Maxwell, and even used a stun gun on her, but that Lois was definitely an escalation. And he volunteered that he had never abducted any strangers. Investigators found hundreds of pairs of panties in his house. Some, he said, were souvenirs from ex-girlfriends, while others, he said, he had stolen from their daughters or friends of his. He even bragged about how he'd get up to use the bathroom when he was visiting a friend, and then he would reach his hand into a dirty laundry bin to steal some underwear. He bragged that he did this about 30 to 40 times without being caught. His house was also filled with bondage and rape films. Despite his confessions, he was steadfast in having no idea what had happened to his wife, Martha Martinez Maxwell. The closest they could get was asking him if he had harmed his wife on that night back in 1992, and his response being, "Not intentionally." Maxwell was found guilty and received 3 life sentences, with a minimum of 60 years behind bars. The reason is because 2 of the sentences were allowed to be served concurrently. Still, that would make his earliest release date be when he is 120 years old. And he's still in prison now. After the trial, Lois said in her victim impact statement, quote, "I want you to know there is a God, and he answered my prayers to spare my life. It's a miracle that I am alive." End quote. After Maxwell's arrest, the Martinez family held out hope that they would finally get some answers, and so they were disappointed when he continued to refuse to talk, despite facing the rest of his life in prison anyways. Carol Martinez said that after she heard about what happened with Lois, it chilled her to the bone, but she also wasn't surprised. Javier said that he was sad that someone had to suffer to shed light on Jeffrey Maxwell's evil. Beyond suspicious of Jeffrey for Martha's disappearance, police began to wonder, was Lois the only other one? Police specifically wanted to look at Jeffrey for a nearby case that was almost identical to Lois's. In February of 2000, 51-year-old Amelia Martinez Smith was working at a taxi company in Irving, Texas. And after finishing her shift at about 10 p.m. on February 3rd, she headed back to her trailer home in Weatherford, Texas. At the time, her husband was visiting his mother, and their children weren't home either, so she was home alone that night. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of February 4th, neighbors spotted smoke and flames coming from her trailer. By the time firefighters arrived around 4 a.m., the home was completely engulfed. Investigators later found someone had also tried to set fire to Smith's car, which was parked nearby. But there was no sign of Smith inside the house or anywhere. She's never been seen or heard from again. Authorities determined that the blaze was intentionally set, but an extensive search turned up no trace of her, and as I said, she's still missing. Foul play is suspected, and I'll have a map up of the different locations, but they're all in pretty close proximity outside of Fort Worth. There is no established connection between Maxwell and Amelia Martinez Smith, and it actually makes me think back to his voluntary, "I've never just grabbed a stranger" thing he offered up without anyone asking. But he also just could have had a connection to her that we don't know about. She was said to be deeply religious and devoted to her family and would not have just run off. And with all of that, this is where we leave off with Martha's case. Like Amelia's, it's without answers, and the person who likely has them is sitting in jail. I hope he has a change of heart and gives Martha's family answers. And there are so many victims that are collateral damage here. Martha and Jeffrey's son once stood by his father, but after the 2011 attack on Lois, he attended one day of the trial and never returned. He reached out to his uncle Javier and said, "I need to know what really happened to my mother." Lois survived her attack but is forever scarred by her ordeal. She told D Magazine that the fire burned her very few cherished earthly possessions: her old manual typewriter, her piano and all of her mother's sheet music, shelves of photo albums, and she no longer owns a picture of her father, and she's not sure that one exists. Normally, this is the spot where I give tip line contact information and plead for information. And I think most of the answers to our questions come from the man sitting in prison. But Rita, or maybe one of his other ex-girlfriends, maybe you know something. Maybe he said something offhanded to you in an argument and it's a clue to where authorities might find a body. You never know. And it's not too late. Jeffrey is behind bars and can no longer hurt you. So now is the time to come forward with information, since up to this point the coward in the jail cell has not. If you have information, please contact the Fort Worth Police Department at 817-392-4430. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please share this podcast with a friend, subscribe on your preferred listening platform, and leave a 5-star review. Any of the Apple review or suggestions on Reddit, I read each and every single one. I also interact with people who leave comments on Spotify and other platforms as much as possible. I now have a subscriber option if you go to the Support This Podcast on Spreaker link at the bottom of the show notes. In addition to just supporting me as an independent podcaster, I'm also going to be creating subscriber content around solved cases and other content that just typically doesn't fit my regular feed but is still important to discuss. Case suggestions can be sent to me at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening and tune in next Monday.